Perhaps the indie sensation of 2022, even though the first version is dated for last year, the genre-defining mixture of bullet hell shooter, roguelike, and more that is the Italian-made Vampire Survivors finally left early access on Steam and Windows 10 last month, and is now available on Xbox for a ridiculously low price and even part of Game Pass. So what is this game, and why is such a simple-looking title sold several million copies already? Find out in the XboxEra review of Vampire Survivors. To start, I'll quickly mention that this review was played on PC as we waited for the Xbox release. So, Vampire Survivors may look basic, too much so even. A single-player game with not particularly inspired 8-bit sprites, of vampire hunters and generic demons that attack them, a shallow green pasture in the top-down background, brain-dead AI enemies whose only job is to run towards the player in an attempt to take them down via touching them, or in some cases, simple straight-line projectile attacks. The player then has to dodge all incoming foes while trying to build up an arsenal of automatically firing weaponry that is randomly obtained and power up via EXP gained from these kills. This at first may appear slow, uninspired, and indeed the player can find themselves literally running in circles, waiting for their cooldown based auto attacks to deal with as many enemies as possible. But of course, you never judge a book by its cover, and Vampire Survivors' depth, variety, and intensity puts most games to shame. The objective here is to survive a whopping 30 minutes in this never-ending barrage of enemies, whose HPs and general danger levels get higher. As is the case with roguelikes, you won't be finishing this in your first try, or maybe even your first dozen tries. Death is expected and a big part of the game, because the coins earned can be used to permanently apply boosts to every individual statistic, such as health, movement speed, or damage. But as the matches become longer and longer, the player can obtain a bigger and bigger arsenal of upgraded weaponry. No longer is our 2D sprite a slowly moving pea shooter. Before long, it can have damaging auras around it. It can push back enemies via knockback effects, it can freeze them, it has assault riflettes barrages of bullets that won't let anybody through, and so on. The intensity of the gameplay rises drastically, and soon enough the match becomes a bouncing act between positioning, how much damage you do per second, and crowd control, as the enemy's predictable AI behavior allows them to be herded around like sheep while you get rid of them. The only breaks in this intense tango are the musical openings of chests, which always feel very rewarding. Now near the end of the 30-minute match, the player will be surrounded by hundreds of enemies that spawn at a faster rate than they can be killed, hence the crowd management becoming key to survival. Fortunately, the variety of strategies and builds is absolutely massive, with all kinds of solutions available. My most frequent choice was using the repellent damage of the garlic weapon, with high damage holy bibles rotating around my fantasy sprite, while blue flames erupt all across the battlefield, generating safe spaces where I could run off to in case the enemy's attack became too much to handle. But that's just one strategy. It's possible to create a spam of axes and knives, have hundreds of bullet-like hell-colored bullets and lasers bounce around the screen, and so on. And heck, that's even before we get to the weirdest weapons, like crawling cats, or the level scenery itself bouncing around as bullets, or even explosive flowers. With 6 upgradable weapons per run, it's easy to become a real killing machine. But it's the 6 extra perks that really customize the builds, perks that allow for things like buffs on movement or attack speed, or increasing the collection distance of items, and of course so much more. Even revives can be thrown into the mix. It's all about pivoting to an ever-evolving battlefield, while the player is usually given a choice of 3 or 4 random weapons, perks, or upgrades to choose from. While later in the game it's possible to re-roll these choices, skip them altogether, or even banish certain items from appearing again in the run, most of the first dozens of unsuccessful or successful runs alike will force players to think about an optimal strategy on the spot, trying to get the best out of their RNG. We did mention it was a roguelike, right? Now all of that is certainly a lot to absorb, but I'd simply suggest anyone to try it for themselves, because it's a formula that's much easier to understand via playing it than reading or watching it. The intensity of the battles, the amount of bullets and foes, the speed of it all just becomes higher and higher, turning what is initially a slow action game into a brutally addictive and rewarding descent into chaos. The variety of builds available rewards experimentation, the permanent upgrades make sure the player is consistently becoming stronger between runs, and as more and more objectives are met, a lot of different arenas and several dozens of characters also become available, in turn unlocking extra skills and weaponry that can then be used in any match. The green pasture of level 1 soon gives way to eerie graveyards, mysterious lands full of plants, and some absolutely psychedelic zones I'd rather not spoil. The player can even unlock new game modes, mutators, special cards that change the game's rules, and so on. Once again, there's a lot of hidden depth in Vampire Survivors. The increasingly tough and bizarre characters, who are all vampire hunters, even though none of the enemies in the game are vampires, even get some level of humorous role via in-game explanations. Here the game's Italian, almost sole creator, Luca Ponco Galante, injected the weapons, the characters, and the stages with more Italian-based puns and humor that, frankly, will be lost on a lot of people who don't speak the language. puns on food, on swear word, on Italian TV personas, and more. Some of the jokes do land in English as well, such as ones making fun of video games like Castlevania, but that's usually not the main target. Sorry, non-Italians. But on the other hand, the game's increasingly esoteric and bizarre lore, stages and unlocks work regardless of your language, and Vampire Survivors' viscerally addictive gameplay can hit regardless of your background. So is there a catch? An infinitely replayable and ridiculously addictive indie phenomenon with wagons of content that only costs like $5 sounds almost too good to be true. And to be fair, the game does have a few shortcomings. For starters, the initial impression may not be the best, with the first stage being rather dull looking and the sprite artwork not really being anything special. It's also when the game is at its slowest and least exciting too, but it's not long before the true bullet heaven begins. Some of the endgame challenges and unlocks are a bit convoluted too, and figuring out what to do without a guide can be complicated, but we're talking about stuff so late in the game that I barely consider this a minus. And as a plus, since I tested the PC version, I mostly played on keyboard, but the controller works exceptionally well too as an input method. The game is so popular that it garnered millions of sales on Steam alone, and it spawned dozens and dozens of clones, some of which are really high quality too. I personally tried over 30 of such clones myself, and while they may beat Ponko's creation in a few individual aspects, usually the graphics at least, Vampire Survivors remains firmly at the top of the so-called bullet heaven genre thanks to a highly addictive gameplay, a masterfully crafted progression, and an insane amount of content and variety, all at a really low price and even part of Xbox Game Pass and Game Pass PC. You really have no excuse. Go try Vampire Survivors as soon as possible, as it's undoubtedly one of the best and most innovative games of 2022.